Hey, nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series here on Heidegger and Aquinas by the post-structuralist. Uh, Post-structuralist, I would say you could almost call him a postmodern Christian in a way, but not exactly a Christian, sort of a religious thinker, John Caputo. And yeah, before I continue here, if you order anything at all on Amazon through my link, literally anything, then I get a little kickback at no extra cost to use. Please do that. And you can give me a tip on Patreon for each individual post. I greatly appreciate that. And if you want to give me like $1 or $5 or $10 a month there, I greatly appreciate that too. Like, subscribe, share, subscribe in particular. That helps a lot. And subscribe to my Rumble page too, please. All right. So, yeah. So today we're going to get into, like I said, we're going to continue Heidegger and Aquinas by John Caputo. And so remember, post-structuralism is not the same as postmodernism. And, you know, postmodernism isn't even what Jordan Peterson says it is. And Foucault and Derrida disagreed with each other, and they looked at each other. They looked at religion differently from a perspective, from completely opposite ways in terms of the concept of deconstruction, and they didn't even use the term deconstruction. It was applied to their work after, along with the terms post-structuralist and postmodernist. But anyway, we don't need to get all into that. So, of course, Heidegger was the famous 20th century existentialist, and I would say he focused a lot on metaphysics and being, his concept of being in a particular, which is a somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat metaphysical concept. And of course, he was a student of Husserl, who was basically essentially the founder of phenomenology. And Heidegger, you could say that he was a phenomenologist as well. So he's basically like an existentialist phenomenologist who focused on metaphysics, something more like that. And of course, Thomas Aquinas is the 13th century Christian and theologian who had tremendously enormous influence on metaphysics that grew to be basically the way that metaphysics is looked at in the Catholic Church today to an extent. And of course, Aristotle, who's going to talk about, practically needs no introduction, but for those who don't know, the famous ancient Greek philosopher. So it's interesting because Heidegger has some interesting work. And of course, as some people know, he was a literal actual Nazi, but in most of his books, he doesn't talk about that. So it's widely recognized among philosophers, as many people know, that he did some really interesting work, even though, like, in spite of that, separating the writer from the writer rather than the artist from the art from the artist, I should say. But anyway, so we're going to get into Heidegger's criticism of Aristotle in terms of logic and Heidegger's idea of being. So I'll oversimplify here, but basically, Heidegger's concept of being is this idea of capital B being, which means that it's sort of like an aspect of reality, almost like, not like I said, not quite, but almost a metaphysical aspect of reality, capital B being. And then you could say we are lowercase b beings within being. Of course, Heidegger likes to talk and write like a philosopher. So smaller case beings are human beings, and beings are living creatures, and we are being. So beings are living creatures, and being is also a state of like an act, being as in like a verb. So beings are being in being. So that's just like a philosopher way of saying that humans exist in the world. You could oversimplify it to that point. So basically, Heidegger's idea of capital B being is, like, you could say this sort of like, it's really hard to use any sort of alternate word for it, but something like reality. But of course, being, because he's really philosopher-y with his language, it's not exactly that way. But to oversimplify for this, let's just say, I'm going to use the word being, but let's say like reality. as a whole. All right, so the theory of categories and the theory of meaning. All right, so the theory of categories distinguishes the diverse modes of being, the separate spheres of objects, the multiple areas of reality. Now, one might expect that Heidegger would. This is him writing about Heidegger, right? John Caputo writing about Heidegger, not Heidegger himself, but he's writing about what Heidegger says about Aristotle, obviously, right? Okay, so now one might expect that Heidegger would turn to Aristotle's doctrine of the 10 categories for such a theory. So he means like they're something like Aristotle. Basically, he changed it a little bit, but he followed something like Plato's uh, basically Plato's realm of forms. So, in the sense that there's this ideal form of a perfect chair, and chairs are different versions of the highest ideal of a chair. So one chair is different from another, and one chair can be closer to the perfect ideal of a chair than another one. You can say that about everything, like literally morality, people, the way you look at things. So you could say that not exactly the same way, like I said, but Aristotle at yeah, you could say metaphysics in a similar way as Plato, in that sense, is in that there's a realm of forms, with the highest form of something being the most perfect example of it, right? But that is precisely but Heidegger is that is precisely what he does not do. So I'll repeat that. Now, one might expect that Heidegger would turn to Aristotle's doctrine of the 10 categories for such a theory, but that is precisely what he does not do. So he rejects Aristotle's logic about metaphysics, like I said, right? For Aristotle's categories are restricted to quote unquote natural reality, ans real. Uh, Heidegger obviously likes to use some German language, which is why part of the trouble of understanding him fully is, lost in translation, as is often the case. But there are specific terms that basically only makes sense to use in the like German sense, the way he uses it. Like Dasein is something like what he means by being, which is actually slightly different than even like a more specific version of being than the more simplified version of the way I'm explaining it, right? All right. But that is precisely what he does not do. For Aristotle's categories are restricted to natural reality, quote unquote natural, to ons real, and thus leave no room for the unique essence of logical being. So, as he's implying there, and a unique essence of logical being is unnatural, and he's going to get to what he means by unnatural there, in terms of something paradoxically being just as natural as something that you might see as the opposite of logical from like a materialist rationalist perspective, typically, I would say. So for Aristotle's categories are restricted to quote unquote natural reality, John's real, and thus leave no room for the unique essence of logical being. They do not cover everything which is thinkable. So Aristotle's missing something, which countless philosophers have pointed out. Heidegger finds instead in the Scotist author. So John Duns Scotus was was a theologian who was extremely influential on the way that Heidegger thinks about metaphysics, and then also, like I said, similarly, but not exactly the same thing, heavily influenced the way that he looked at being, which was his whole main thing in philosophy, right? Oh, I locked my phone that has the quote here. But yeah, so being was Heidegger's main thing, and John Duns Scotus had a major influence on the way that Heidegger thought about metaphysics and being. All right, so Heidegger finds instead in the Scotus author a wider notion of being, one which includes both real and logical or irreal being. See what he's doing there? That's why Heidegger can be interesting. So basically, like what he was getting at there earlier, is that natural reality natural reality also includes irreal being. So logical is irreal being, but the illogical is real. So he's making it sound like the illogical is more real than the logical, right? But if you know anything about Heidegger, it basically is probably more the case that he's uh, basically he's saying that being or natural reality we could use as sort of a synonym for this, but again, it's not exactly the same thing. So being or natural reality includes both the logical and illogical. So the logical is just as much an essential aspect of reality as the illogical, right? And he gets a little bit more into this distinction between the logical and the illogical, both being part of natural reality. Leave no room for the unique essence of logical being. They do not cover everything which is thinkable. Heidegger finds instead in the Scotus author a wider notion of being, one which includes both real and logical or irreal being. Hence, the true categories are to be found in the notion of being as that which is most common to all. So, again, like being, you could say, is essentially this fundamental aspect of reality that is common to us all. The way you could even say our subjective experience within objective reality from a certain perspective and a certain interpretation of Heidegger's, because that's that's basically what it means to be beings, human beings being in being, human beings existing in reality, essentially. All right. So true categories are to be found in the notion being is that which is most common to all, the thinkable in the widest possible sense, and the transcendental properties which are convertible with being. Again, transcendental in a Kantian sense, as in Immanuel Kant, the idea that, again, I oversimplify transcendentalism, I'll oversimplify it a little bit here, even more than I oversimplify being, but you could say that transcendent is like above human experience from a Platonic or like Plato's perspective or Aristotle's perspective as well. So it's above human experience, but it's possible to access metaphysically in theory. I would say that's the difference between transcendent and transcendental. Whereas uh, in that transcendental, you could say that it's more transcendent than transcendent, in that it's not even possible for humans to access, even metaphysically. It's impossible for us to access or comprehend in any possible way. And this doesn't have to be a religious way. You're not necessarily talking about God, although it's often used in theology. But you can view transcendental categories in the Kantian style. You can use that for literally anything. You can use it to talk about morality or any other philosophical issue, basically. So yeah, like as I said, you could basically oversimplify that transcendental is more transcendent than transcendent. All right, the thinkable in the widest possible sense, and the transcendental properties which are convertible with being, specifically the one and the true. Okay, so like I was saying, so being or natural reality is the way he's describing it within the context of being. So, being or natural reality includes the logical and illogical, and the illogical is more real than the logical. But the irreal or the logical and the real or the illogical are both still fundamental aspects of being in natural reality. And truth is too. You could say when he's referencing either the one and the true, you could say part of being is the one and the true. Being, you could, like, again, it's to oversimplify, almost more like a almost more of like a metaphysical approach, like an essential aspect of reality in the way that capital B being is, right? From like you could say logical reality or truth. And he means this in like the truth, like a scientific way. You could almost look at it like different types of truth in the way that many philosophers look at it, right? You could say that there's like objective scientific truth and subjective metaphysical truth, something like that. Again, oversimplifications. But so you could say that Heidegger is saying that logical and illogical being, or to even oversimplify even further, metaphysics and truth are both essential aspects of human beings living in natural reality. All right, so he singles out these two in particular, the one and the true. He singles out these two in particular in order to account for the being of mathematical and logical objects. So he's saying we need truth because mathematical and logical objects exist. So he's not saying like, everything is subjective. Like I said, he was getting at like the metaphysical and the irreal are just as fundamental aspects of reality as logic and math. Logic and math is a fundamental aspect of reality, but so is being in a somewhat metaphysical sense. Okay. He singles out these two in particular, the one and the true, in particular in order to account for the being of mathematical and logical objects. Needless to say, the scholastic notion of ons, again, I don't need to get into this specifically, I've gotten into it before, but I'll oversimplify here more. Needless to say, the scholastic notion of ons, which are ends, which the ENS, which the younger Heidegger studied, primarily signifies not essay but essence. And there's he goes into a lot more detail about his distinction between essay and essence in some earlier videos. So check out any of my videos on basically Heidegger, and I've probably talked about his relationship to metaphysics, if not specifically in terms of this book, because some of my favorite philosophers like Slavoj Žižek talk about Heidegger a lot, and plenty of others do, like Nietzsche and countless others. Well, no, obviously not Nietzsche, because Heidegger lived way after Nietzsche. But yeah, anyway, so needless to say, the scholastic notion, scholastic in the sense of like scholastic theology of the period of somewhere around the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas was a living theologian and priest, right? Okay, so needless to say, the scholastic notion of ons, or ons, which the younger Heidegger studied, primarily signifies not essay, but essence. So an essence is, as he's gotten into it before, it's kind of connected to the idea of being, and it's kind of part of it, but not really. It's kind of just like a somewhat connected concept. Yeah, Heidegger gets fucking complex, as any of you who are even mildly familiar with him know. So, yeah, as usual, I think Heidegger's thoughts are somewhat confusing, but if you get into them in a little bit of detail and you know some of the surrounding context a little bit, it's more easy to understand. And as usual, he makes, as often is the case with really sophisticated philosophers, he's making a really interesting point, which I somewhat agree with, or if not, I just find really interesting and compelling, that being, to put it as concisely as possible, let's say that Heidegger would say that that in terms of being in reality, logical and illogical, or real and illogical being, are both fundamental aspects of reality. So let's say, to oversimplify even more in terms of being, metaphysics and logic are both completely different but equally necessary fundamental aspects of reality.